The blade whistled through the air, missing Maria Hernandez by mere inches as she pressed herself against the stone wall of the tower. Her scarred hands gripped the cold stones, knuckles white with desperation. Below in the courtyard, Roy Gonzalez stood motionless in his black armor, his sword drawn but held low, watching as three mounted knights circled him like wolves. The winter wind howled through the battlements, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke from the burning village beyond the castle walls. "Give us the woman and we'll make your death quick," called out Frank White, his voice echoing off the castle stones. His destroyer pawed the ground impatiently, breath steaming in the frigid air. "She's brought nothing but misfortune to this place. Even her own father cast her out." Maria's breath came in short, painful gasps. The scar that ran from her left temple down to her jaw throbbed in the cold, a permanent reminder of the fire that had claimed her beauty and her betrothal 3 winters past. She had thought herself safe here, hidden away in Roy's forgotten tower on the edge of the kingdom. But safety was an illusion for women like her. Women marked by fate and abandoned by family. Roy's response was barely audible above the wind, but his meaning was clear. "She stays." The words sent a chill through Maria that had nothing to do with the winter air. In all her 22 years, no one had ever chosen to keep her. Not her father, who had cast her out when the marriage alliance crumbled along with her face. Not the convent, which had refused her when the dowry proved insufficient. Not even the merchants who might have taken her as a servant, too superstitious to employ someone so obviously cursed by God. But here stood Roy Gonzalez, the Black Knight of Ravenshollow, facing 3 armed men rather than surrender her to their justice. It made no sense. She was nothing to him, just another mouth to feed through the harsh winter months. Just another burden in a tower that had already seen too many women come and go. The confrontation in the courtyard had been building for weeks, ever since Tyler Gonzalez had arrived with news from the capital. Roy's younger brother had brought word that the king was demanding tribute, that the lords were choosing sides in the coming war, and that harboring undesirable women was no longer a luxury any knight could afford. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. But to understand how Maria Hernandez came to be pressed against that tower wall, fighting for her life alongside a knight who barely spoke to her, we must go back 6 months to the day she first arrived at Ravenshollow, carrying nothing but a torn cloak and a letter of introduction that might as well have been her death warrant. The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days when Maria first saw the black tower rising from the moors like a finger pointed accusingly at the gray scuppum. Her feet were raw and bleeding inside her worn boots, and the fever from her infected wounds had left her dizzy and weak. The merchant who had given her passage this far had deposited her at the crossroads with barely a word, eager to be rid of his scarred cargo before anyone could associate him with her misfortune. The tower stood alone, separated from the main castle by a quarter-mile of boggy ground and connected only by a narrow stone causeway that disappeared beneath the floodwaters. It looked abandoned, which suited Maria perfectly. She had grown accustomed to abandoned places, to the spaces between civilization where broken things could exist without judgment. She had not expected to find Roy Gonzalez waiting for her. He stood in the doorway of the tower as she approached, a tall figure in simple black clothing that seemed to absorb what little light the cloudy day provided. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of his hood, but she could see enough to know that he was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years at most. The letter had described him as the Black Knight, a title that conjured images of grizzled veterans and battle-scarred warriors. This man looked more like a monk who had taken up arms reluctantly. "Maria Hernandez," he said as she reached the entrance. It was not a question. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was something in it that made her stop walking and look up at him properly. "Yes, my lord." She kept her scarred side turned away from him, a habit so ingrained that she barely thought about it anymore. "I have a letter from Father Benedict. He said you might have need of a housekeeper." Roy extended his hand and she placed the sealed parchment in his palm, careful not to let their fingers touch. She had learned that people found even accidental contact with her skin disturbing, as if her misfortune might be contagious. He broke the seal and read in silence while the rain continued to fall around them. The letter was brief, she knew, because she had been present when Father Benedict dictated it, It explained that she was skilled in household management, that she was of good moral character despite her appearance, and that she would work for nothing more than food and shelter. It did not mention that she was the daughter of Lord Ethan Ramirez, or that she had once been considered one of the most beautiful women in the northern provinces. It did not need to. The scar told that story well enough. "You may enter," Roy said finally, stepping aside to allow her passage. "But understand this, women do not last long in this place. The winter here is harsh, and I am not given to charity. If you cannot earn your keep, you will be sent away before the first snow." Maria nodded, too exhausted to feel the sting of his words. She had heard similar warnings before, in the months since her father had cast her out. Everyone was eager to explain why they could not help her, why their charity had limits, why her presence was a burden they could not long bear. At least Roy Gonzalez was honest about it. The interior of the tower was sparse but clean, with thick stone walls that blocked out the sound of the wind and rain. A fire burned in the great hearth, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn furniture. There were signs that other women had lived here recently. A basket of mending left on a table, a shawl draped over a chair, the lingering scent of lavender in the air. "Where are the others?" Maria asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was not her place to inquire about his household arrangements. "Gone," Roy replied simply. He moved to the fire and added another log, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "The last one left a fortnight ago, said the isolation was driving her mad." He turned to look at her then, and for the first time Maria saw his face clearly. He was handsome in a severe way, with dark eyes and sharp features that might have been carved from the same stone as his tower. But there was something else there, something that made her breath catch in her throat. He was looking directly at her scar, studying it without flinching or turning away. "Does it pain you?" he asked. The question was so unexpected that Maria forgot to be defensive. "Sometimes," she admitted, "when the weather changes or when I'm very tired." Roy nodded as if this was useful information. "There are herbs that help with such things. I'll show you where they grow when the rain stops." It was a small kindness, but it hit Maria like a physical blow. She had grown so accustomed to people avoiding the subject of her disfigurement that his matter-of-fact acknowledgement of it felt almost revolutionary. Here was a man who could look at her ruined face and speak of practical solutions rather than divine punishment or tragic fate. The days that followed established a routine that Maria found surprisingly comfortable. She rose before dawn to tend the fire and prepare a simple breakfast of porridge and dried fruit. Roy would appear as the sun crested the horizon, already dressed and ready for his daily patrol of the surrounding lands. He would eat in silence, nod his thanks, and disappear for hours at a time, leaving Maria to manage the tower as she saw fit. She threw herself into the work with a determination that surprised even her. The tower had been neglected by its previous occupants, and there was much to be done. She scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, organized the storage rooms, and mended the tapestries that hung on the walls. The physical labor felt good after months of aimless wandering, and the solitude was a blessing rather than a curse. Roy was a man of few words, but Maria began to understand him through his actions. He brought her fresh meat from his hunts, always ensuring she had the choicest cuts. He repaired the shutters on her chamber window without being asked, and he left books on her table, carefully chosen volumes of poetry and philosophy that suggested he had been paying attention to her interests. Most surprisingly, he kept his promise about the herbs. On the first clear dated after her arrival, he led her to a sheltered valley behind the tower where dozens of medicinal plants grew wild among the rocks. He showed her how to identify feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, and a dozen other remedies that she had never heard of. "How do you know so much about healing?" she asked as they gathered the precious plants. "Necessity," Roy replied. "When you live alone, you learn to tend your own wounds." There was something in his voice that made Maria look at him more closely. She noticed then what she had missed before, the thin white scar that ran along his left forearm, barely visible beneath his sleeve, the slight stiffness in his right shoulder when he moved, the way he favored his left leg when he thought no one was watching. "You've been hurt," she said softly. Roy's hand stilled on the plant he was harvesting. "We all have. It was the closest thing to a personal revelation he had shared, and Maria treasured it like a precious gem. She began to watch him more carefully after that, learning to read the subtle signs of his moods and needs. She noticed that he ate less when he was worried, that he stayed out longer when news arrived from the outside world, that he sometimes stood at the tower window for hours, staring out at the moors, as if expecting enemies to emerge from the mist. The first test of their arrangement came with the arrival of Tyler Gonzalez in late October. Roy's younger brother was everything that Roy was not: loud, gregarious, quick to laugh, and quicker to anger. He arrived with a small retinue of knights and servants, their horses clattering across the causeway like thunder. Maria was in the kitchen when she heard the commotion, and her first instinct was to hide. She had learned to make herself invisible when strangers came calling, to avoid the inevitable stares and whispered comments about her appearance. But Roy appeared in the doorway before she could slip away. "My brother has come," he said simply. "You will serve the evening meal." It was not a request, and Maria nodded her understanding. She had known this day would come eventually. Roy could not hide her presence forever, and she would have to face the judgment of others sooner or later. Tyler Gonzalez was drunk by the time the meal was served, his face flushed with wine and good humor. He regaled the table with stories from court, tales of tournaments and political intrigue that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Maria moved silently around the room, filling cups and clearing plates, trying to remain as inconspicuous as possible. But Tyler's attention was not so easily avoided. "Brother," he said loudly, gesturing toward Maria with his wine cup. "You didn't tell me your new housekeeper was so distinctive." The room fell silent. Maria felt her cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on the floor and continued her work. She had endured worse comments than this, and she would endure this too. "Her appearance is not your concern," Roy said quietly. Tyler laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Come now, Roy, surely you can do better than damaged goods. There are plenty of whole women who would be grateful for the position." Maria's hands trembled as she reached for an empty platter, but she forced herself to keep moving. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her break down. "That's enough." Roy's voice cut through the room like a blade, and suddenly the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. "Maria is under my protection. Any man who speaks ill of her answers to me." The silence that followed Roy's declaration stretched like a taut bowstring. Tyler's drunken grin faded as he realized his brother was deadly serious. The other knights shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly finding their wine cups intensely interesting. Maria stood frozen by the sideboard, an empty platter clutched in her trembling hands. "Roy," Tyler said carefully, his voice sobered by the threat he heard in his brother's tone. "I meant no harm. I was merely observing that a man of your station could afford to be more selective." "My selection is made," Roy replied. He had not raised his voice, but there was steel in every word. "Maria stays. The subject is closed." Tyler nodded slowly, recognizing the futility of further argument. He had always been the more diplomatic of the two brothers, quick to retreat when he sensed he had pushed too far. "Of course, brother, your household is your own concern." The remainder of the meal passed in strained silence. Maria finished her duties as quickly as possible and retreated to her chamber, her heart pounding with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Roy had defended her, publicly and decisively, but at what cost? She had seen the looks that passed between Tyler and his men, the subtle shake of heads that suggested they thought their host had taken leave of his senses. She was still awake when Tyler's party departed the next morning, their horses splashing through the shallow water of the causeway in the gray dawn light. She watched from her window as Roy stood in the courtyard, his farewell to his brother brief and formal. When the last rider disappeared into the mist, Roy remained where he was for a long time, staring after them as if he could see into the future they carried with them. That afternoon, Maria found him in the tower's small library, reading by the light of a single candle. She had prepared his favorite meal, a hearty stew with fresh bread, but he barely touched it when she set the tray beside him. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Defend me, I mean. I'm accustomed to such comments." Roy looked up from his book, his dark eyes unreadable in the candlelight. No one should become accustomed to cruelty. Your brother thinks you're making a mistake, keeping me here. My brother thinks many things. Most of them are wrong. Maria moved closer, emboldened by his matter-of-fact tone. He's not wrong about my appearance. I know what I look like. I know what people see when they look at me. Roy set down his book and studied her face with the same careful attention he gave to his maps and correspondence. What do you think I see when I look at you? The question caught her off guard. She had expected platitudes about inner beauty or divine purpose, the sort of empty comfort that well-meaning people offered to make themselves feel better about her suffering. But Roy's question demanded honesty, both from her and from himself. I think you see someone useful, she said finally. Someone who works hard and asks for little in return. Someone who won't cause you political difficulties or social embarrassment. Because I'm already beyond such considerations. Roy was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the leather binding of his book. You're not entirely wrong, he said at last. But you're not entirely right either. He stood and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening moors. I see someone who understands what it means to be cast out. Someone who knows the value of sanctuary because she has lived without it. Someone who doesn't expect me to be other than what I am. Maria felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a knot she hadn't realized was there. And what are you? A man who prefers solitude to society, who finds peace in empty spaces and quiet voices, who has learned that the world's judgment is often the opposite of its truth. He turned back to face her, and in the flickering candlelight, his expression was almost gentle. You think your scar makes you hideous. I think it makes you real. Everything else in this world is painted and perfumed and false. You cannot hide what you are, and so you have learned to be genuinely what you are. That is rarer than beauty and more valuable than gold. Maria felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. She had cried enough tears over her appearance to fill the castle's moat. You speak as if you know something of being judged unfairly. Roy's smile was brief and bitter. The Black Knight of Raven's Hollow. Do you know how I earned that title? Maria shook her head. She had heard whispers, fragments of stories about battles fought in distant lands and deeds done in shadow, but nothing concrete. I killed a man in single combat, a nobleman's son who thought his birth gave him the right to take what he wanted from those beneath his station. He was wrong, but his death made me many enemies at court. They could not challenge the legality of the duel, so they made me a symbol instead. The Black Knight, the Dark Lord of the Empty Tower, a cautionary tale about the dangers of defying one's betters. He returned to his chair and picked up his book, but he did not open it. So you see, Maria Hernandez, we are both marked by the world's judgment, both cast out for refusing to accept what others thought we should endure. Perhaps that is why I find your presence comfortable. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her, and Maria treasured every word. She understood now why he had chosen this isolated tower, why he lived apart from the world that had branded him a villain. He was not hiding from his reputation so much as refusing to perform it. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the northern mountains with a ferocity that caught even the local farmers by surprise. By the first week of November, snow lay 3 feet deep around the tower, and the causeway was impassable except on foot. Maria found herself truly isolated for the first time since her arrival, cut off from the outside world with only Roy for company. She had expected the solitude to drive her mad, as it had his previous housekeepers. Instead, she discovered a peace she had never known before. The tower became a world unto itself, warm and safe and blessedly quiet. She and Roy fell into an easy rhythm, sharing meals and conversations by the fire, reading together in comfortable silence, working side by side to maintain their small domain. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Maria finally asked the question that had been haunting her since Tyler's visit. Why don't I last? She said, looking up from the shirt she was mending. The other women, I mean. What drives them away? Roy was seated across from her, sharpening his sword with long, methodical strokes. He paused in his work and considered her question carefully. Loneliness, he said finally. They come here expecting to find a life like the ones they left behind. Neighbors to gossip with, markets to visit, festivals to attend. When they realize that this tower is all there is, that I am all there is, they begin to feel trapped. And then they begin to blame me for their isolation. They demand that I take them to town, that I host gatherings, that I become someone I am not for their entertainment. When I refuse, they grow resentful. The arrangement becomes a battle of wills, and eventually they choose to leave rather than surrender. Maria nodded, understanding more than he perhaps realized. They wanted you to change for them. Yes, and when I would not, they decided I was cruel, selfish, unfeeling. He resumed his sharpening, the rhythmic sound of steel on stone filling the silence. Perhaps they were right. No, Maria said firmly. They were wrong to expect you to be other than what you are. You made no false promises. You offered shelter and asked for service in return. If they wanted more than that, they should have sought it elsewhere. Roy looked up at her, surprise flickering in his dark eyes. You don't find this life limiting? Maria considered the question seriously. She thought of her father's castle with its constant stream of visitors and endless social obligations. She remembered the exhausting effort of maintaining appearances, of being always on display, always performing the role of the perfect nobleman's daughter. She recalled the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the careful arrangements that kept her scarred side hidden from important guests. I find it honest, she said at last. Here I can simply be. I don't have to pretend to be grateful for scraps of kindness or apologize for taking up space in the world. I don't have to smile when people pity me or lower my eyes when they stare. I can just exist. Roy set down his sword and gave her his full attention. And that's enough? Just existing? It's more than I had before. Maria tied off her thread and held up the mended shirt, examining her work in the firelight. Before I came here, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Present but not really there, seen but not acknowledged. Here, when you look at me, you see me. All of me, including the parts the world finds unacceptable. That's not limiting, Roy. That's liberating. Something shifted in Roy's expression, a softening that made him look younger and more vulnerable. I had not thought of it that way. Because you've never had to live as a ghost, Maria replied gently. You've been cast out, yes, but you were cast out as yourself. You were allowed to keep your identity, your dignity, your sense of self-worth. I had to leave all of that behind when I left my father's house. Here, with you, I'm beginning to remember who I was before the world told me I was nothing. The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the stone walls. Outside, the wind howled through the battlements, but inside the tower, all was warm and still. Maria, Roy said quietly, I want you to know that you are not nothing. You never were nothing. The world was simply too blind to see your worth. The words hit her like a physical blow, so unexpected and so sincere that she felt tears spring to her eyes. She had waited her entire life to hear someone say those words and mean them, not as empty comfort or polite platitude, but as simple truth. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Roy nodded and returned to his sword, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Something had been acknowledged between them, something that went deeper than the practical arrangement of their cohabitation. Maria felt it like a warm current in her chest, a recognition that she was not alone in the world after all. December brought news that shattered their peaceful isolation. Raymond Adams, the king's tax collector, arrived at the tower on a bitter, cold morning, his horse steaming and his face red with cold and anger. Maria watched from the kitchen window as Roy met him in the courtyard, their conversation brief and heated. When Raymond departed an hour later, Roy's expression was grim. He found Maria in the kitchen where she was preparing the midday meal and delivered the news without preamble. The king is demanding increased tribute, he said, double what I paid last year to fund his war against the northern rebels. I have until spring to produce the gold or forfeit my lands. Maria's hands stilled on the bread she was kneading. Do you have it? The gold, I mean? No. Roy's answer was flat and final. I have enough to maintain this tower and its occupants through the winter, but not enough to satisfy the king's greed. I'll have to sell something, or find another source of income. What will you sell? Roy was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the snow-covered moors. There's a merchant in the capital who's been asking about you, he said finally. Maria's blood turned to ice in her veins. What kind of merchant? The kind who specializes in unusual acquisitions, curiosities for wealthy collectors who tire of conventional beauty. Roy's voice was carefully neutral, but Maria could hear the disgust beneath his calm tone. He's offering a considerable sum for a woman of noble birth with distinctive features. The bread dough fell from Maria's nerveless fingers. She had heard whispers of such men, collectors who treated human beings like exotic animals, displaying them for the entertainment of their equally depraved friends. The thought of being sold to such a creature made her stomach lurch with revulsion. I see, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. I told him no, Roy continued. But Raymond made it clear that the king will not accept excuses. If I cannot pay the tribute, I will lose everything. The tower, the lands, my title, everything. Maria forced herself to breathe slowly, fighting down the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. She had known this day would come eventually. She had been living in a fantasy, believing that she could find permanent sanctuary in Roy's tower. But sanctuary was a luxury that men like Roy could not afford indefinitely. How much is he offering? She asked. Roy turned to look at her, his expression sharp with alarm. No, whatever you're thinking, the answer is no. I'm not thinking anything, Maria lied. I'm simply trying to understand the situation. The situation is that I will find another way. I'll sell my armor, my horses, whatever is necessary. But I will not sell you like a piece of livestock. And if there is no other way? If the choice comes down to your lands or my freedom? Roy crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grasped her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. Maria, listen to me. I would rather lose everything I own than betray your trust. You are not a commodity to be traded for gold. You are not a solution to my financial problems. You are a person with dignity and worth, and I will not allow anyone to treat you as less than that. Maria looked into his eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there. He meant every syllable, she realized. He would actually choose poverty and exile over her suffering. The knowledge was both heartwarming and terrifying. You would sacrifice everything for me? She asked. Yes. The simple word hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Maria felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of the world, of herself, of what was possible between 2 damaged souls who had found each other in the wilderness. We buy, she whispered. Roy's hands moved from her shoulders to frame her face, his thumbs gently tracing the edges of her scar. Because you matter, Maria. Because your happiness matters. Because a world that would buy and sell human suffering is not a world worth preserving. Maria closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, feeling the last of her defenses crumble. She had spent so long protecting herself from hope, from the possibility of being truly valued by another person, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be cherished. I love you, she said, the words falling from her lips like a confession and a prayer combined. Roy's breath caught, and when she opened her eyes, she saw wonder and fear warring in his expression. Maria, I know it changes nothing, she said quickly. I know you cannot return the feeling, and I don't expect you to. I just needed you to know that someone in this world loves you exactly as you are, that your kindness and your strength and your integrity have not gone unnoticed or unappreciated. Roy was silent for a long moment, his hands still cradling her face as if she were made of precious crystal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. It changes everything, he said, and I do return the feeling. I have for months, but I was afraid to speak it. Afraid you would think I was taking advantage of your gratitude or your dependence on my protection. The confession hung between them like a fragile soap bubble, beautiful and impossible, and ready to burst at the slightest touch. Maria stared into Roy's eyes, searching for any sign that he was speaking from pity or obligation rather than genuine feeling. She found none. You love me? She asked, her voice barely audible. I love your strength, Roy said softly. I love your resilience. I love the way you see beauty in small things, the way you find joy in simple pleasures. I love your laugh, which I hear so rarely that I treasure each occurrence like a precious gift. I love your mind, your wit, your capacity for forgiveness. I love the way you make this empty tower feel like a home. He paused, his thumb still tracing the line of her scar with infinite gentleness. And yes, I love your face, all of it. The parts the world calls beautiful and the parts it calls ruined. Because it's your face and therefore perfect to me. Maria felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for once they were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a joy so profound it threatened to lift her off her feet. I never thought, she began, then stopped, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Neither did I, Roy admitted. I thought love was for other people, whole people, people who fit properly into the world's expectations. I never imagined I could feel this way about anyone, or that anyone could feel this way about me. Maria reached up to cover his hands with her own, pressing his palms more firmly against her cheeks. We're a pair of fools, aren't we? Two broken people who found each other in the ruins and mistook it for accident rather than destiny. Roy smiled then, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. The stern lines softened, the shadows lifted, and for a moment he looked like the young man he might have been in a kinder world. Perhaps, he said, but if this is foolishness, then I choose to be a fool for the rest of my life. He leaned forward and kissed her then, softly and carefully, as if he were afraid she might shatter beneath his touch. Maria had been kissed before, by her former betrothed and by other suitors who had sought her father's favor. But those kisses had been political gestures, empty performances designed to seal bargains and secure alliances. This was different. This was Roy choosing her, claiming her, declaring without words that she was precious to him. When they finally broke apart, Maria felt as if the world had been remade around them. The kitchen was the same, the snow still fell outside the windows. The king's demands still hung over them like a sword, but everything had changed nonetheless. She was no longer alone. She was no longer unwanted. She was loved, completely and unconditionally, by a man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. What do we do now? She asked. Roy's expression grew serious again as the practical realities of their situation reasserted themselves. Now we find a way to keep you safe. The merchant's offer is still on the table, and there will be others like him. Men who see your scars as exotic rather than tragic, but who see you as property nonetheless. And the king's tribute? I'll find another way to raise the gold. I have until spring, and desperate men have been known to accomplish impossible things when properly motivated. Maria nodded, but her mind was already working on the problem from another angle. She had been raised in a nobleman's household, trained from childhood in the arts of negotiation and diplomacy. She understood the game of power and influence better than Roy perhaps realized. What if we could find a way to make me more valuable to you than to anyone else? She asked slowly. Roy frowned. What do you mean? Marriage, Maria said simply. If I were your wife rather than your servant, I could not be sold or taken without your consent. I would be under your legal protection, not merely your personal protection. Roy's eyes widened. Maria, you don't understand what you're suggesting. Marriage to me would make you a social pariah. You would be cut off from any possibility of returning to respectable society. You would be bound to this tower, to this isolation, for the rest of your life. And you don't understand what you're offering me, Maria replied. Respectability? I lost that the day my face was burned. Society? I was cast out of it long ago. This tower, this isolation, this life with you? It's not a prison, Roy. It's paradise. She moved closer to him, her hands finding his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palms. Marry me, she said, not to solve your financial problems or to protect me from collectors. Marry me because you love me and I love you, and because we have found something rare and precious in this harsh world. Roy stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the decision. He was thinking of her welfare, she knew, trying to calculate whether marriage to him would help or harm her in the long run. It was typical of his character that he would put her interest before his own desires. "The world will call it a scandal," he said finally. "The Black Knight and the Scarred Lady. They'll say I took advantage of your desperation, that you settled for me because no one else would have you." "Let them say what they will," Maria replied firmly. "We know the truth. We know that what we have is real and good and worth defending. That's all that matters." Roy's internal struggle played out across his features like clouds racing across the sky. Maria could see the moment when love triumphed over caution, when desire overcame duty, when he finally allowed himself to believe that happiness might be possible for people like them. "Yes," he said, the word emerging like a breath he had been holding for years. "Yes, I'll marry you, but not for protection or convenience or any practical reason. I'll marry you because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Maria laughed, the sound bright and joyous in the warm kitchen. "Then we're agreed. We'll face whatever comes together as husband and wife." "Together," Roy repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. I like the sound of that. They were married 3 days later, in a simple ceremony performed by Father Benedict, who had made the treacherous journey from the village despite the snow. The old priest had known Maria since childhood and had been the one to arrange her placement at the tower. He seemed genuinely pleased by the match, blessing their union with words about finding light in darkness and hope in despair. Andrea Kim and Mary Martin, two women from the village who had served as Maria's companions during her youth, attended as witnesses. They had insisted on coming despite the dangerous conditions, bringing with them a simple wedding feast and Maria's mother's ring, which her father had finally consented to send. It was not the grand ceremony Maria had once dreamed of as a young girl, with hundreds of guests and elaborate decorations and musicians playing late into the night. But as she stood beside Roy in the tower's great hall, speaking vows of love and fidelity in front of their small gathering of friends, she realized that this was better than any fantasy she had ever constructed. This was real. This was chosen. This was theirs. The weeks that followed their wedding were the happiest of Maria's life. She and Roy settled into their new roles as husband and wife with an ease that surprised them both. The practical aspects of their relationship remained largely unchanged, but the emotional landscape had been transformed entirely. They were no longer two isolated individuals sharing space out of convenience. They were partners, allies, lovers in the truest sense of the word. Roy began to speak more freely about his past, sharing stories of his childhood with Tyler, his training as a knight, the events that had led to his exile from court. Maria reciprocated by telling him about her life before the fire, about her dreams and fears, and the gradual erosion of hope that had preceded her arrival at his tower. They made plans for the future, modest plans that revolved around their small domain and the life they were building together. Roy spoke of expanding the herb garden, of perhaps keeping a few sheep for wool and milk. Maria suggested they might take in other outcasts, people who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. "We could make this place a sanctuary," she said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Not just for us, but for anyone who needs refuge from the world's cruelty." Roy considered this, his expression thoughtful. "It would be dangerous. Harboring fugitives and outcasts would give our enemies more ammunition to use against us." "We're already dangerous to them," Maria pointed out. "We're living proof that their judgments are not absolute, that people they have discarded can still find happiness and purpose. Adding a few more refugees to our household won't change that fundamental threat to their worldview." "You're right," Roy said slowly. "And I confess the idea appeals to me. This tower has been empty for too long. It would be good to fill it with people who understand its value." But their peaceful interlude was not destined to last. In February, as the worst of the winter began to ease, Tyler returned to the tower. And this time, he was not alone. Tyler arrived with a small army at his back. 20 knights in full battle gear, who arranged themselves around the tower like pieces on a chessboard. Maria watched from the window of their bedchamber as they took positions, cutting off all routes of escape and establishing a siege perimeter that spoke of serious intent. "They're not here for a social visit," she observed, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her chest. Roy stood beside her, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. No, he agreed grimly. Tyler has come to collect what he thinks I owe. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal in its efficiency. Tyler entered the tower with Frank White and Ethan Ramirez, two knights Maria recognized from court, their faces set in expressions of cold determination. They found Roy and Maria in the Great Hall, standing together before the fireplace like defendants awaiting judgment. Brother, Tyler said without preamble, I've come to discuss your debt to the crown. I have until spring to raise the tribute, Roy replied evenly. The deadline has not yet passed. The deadline has been moved, Frank White interjected. The king requires immediate payment or immediate satisfaction of the debt through other means. Maria felt Roy tense beside her, his warrior instincts recognizing the threat before his conscious mind had fully processed it. What other means? Tyler's smile was cold and calculating. The merchant I mentioned has increased his offer. He's now willing to pay triple the original amount for your wife. He spoke the word as if it tasted bitter on his tongue, enough to cover your tribute and provide a comfortable surplus besides. No. Roy's refusal was immediate and absolute. Find another solution. There is no other solution, Ethan Ramirez said flatly. You have nothing else of value to sell, and the king will not accept promises or promissory notes. The woman goes to the merchant, or you forfeit your lands and title. Those are your only choices. Maria stepped forward, drawing the attention of all three men. What if I choose to go willingly? Would that change the terms of the arrangement? Maria, no, Roy said sharply, but she held up a hand to silence him. I'm not agreeing to anything, she said calmly. I'm simply exploring our options. If I were to consent to the sale, would my husband's debts be forgiven entirely? Tyler nodded slowly. The merchant's payment would more than satisfy the king's demands. Roy would keep his lands and his title, and you would be well cared for in your new position. Maria almost laughed at the euphemism. Well cared for, as if she were a prize horse being sold to a new stable. But she kept her expression neutral as she considered the offer from every angle. And if I refuse? Then you'll be taken anyway, Frank White said bluntly. The king's authority supersedes your husband's protection. You will go to the merchant regardless, but Roy will lose everything in the process. It was a masterful trap, Maria had to admit. Tyler had maneuvered them into a position where resistance was futile and cooperation was the only rational choice. Except that rationality had never been Maria's strongest suit, especially when it came to accepting other people's definitions of her worth. I see, she said quietly. So my choices are to go willingly and save my husband's lands, or go unwillingly and watch him lose everything. Is that correct? That's correct, Tyler confirmed. Maria nodded thoughtfully and then turned to Roy with a smile that was part apology and part defiance. I'm sorry, my love, but there's a third option they haven't considered. Before anyone could react, she pulled a small knife from her belt, the one she used for kitchen work, and pressed its point against her throat. The blade was sharp enough to draw a thin line of blood, and the men in the room froze as they realized what she was threatening. The third option, Maria said conversationally, is that I die right here, right now, and become worthless to everyone. The merchant gets nothing, the king gets nothing, and my husband keeps both his lands and his dignity. The silence that followed Maria's threat was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The three knights stared at her in shock, clearly unprepared for such a dramatic escalation. Roy's face had gone white with terror, but he remained perfectly still, recognizing that any sudden movement might cause her to follow through on her threat. You're bluffing, Tyler said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. Am I? Maria pressed the knife a little deeper, feeling another drop of blood trace its way down her neck. I've spent the last 3 years of my life being treated as a commodity, something to be bought and sold and traded at the whim of men who see me as less than human. I won't spend the rest of my life in that condition. Maria, please, Roy said softly, his voice breaking on the words. Don't do this. We'll find another way. There is no other way, Maria replied, her eyes never leaving Tyler's face. You heard them. The king's authority supersedes your protection. They can take me whenever they choose, and there's nothing you can do to stop them. Unless, of course, there's nothing left to take. Frank White took a half step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword. But Maria's sharp laugh stopped him cold. Please do, she said mockingly. Draw your bishop on an unarmed woman who's already holding a blade to her own throat. I'm sure that will end well for everyone involved. Ethan Ramirez cleared his throat nervously. Lady Maria, surely we can reach some accommodation. Perhaps we could negotiate different terms with the merchant or find another buyer who would be more considerate of your comfort. You still don't understand, Maria said, shaking her head in amazement. This isn't about comfort or accommodation or finding a kinder master. This is about the fundamental principle that I am not for sale. I belong to myself and to my husband by my own free choice. I will not be owned by anyone else, under any circumstances, for any price. She turned to look at Roy, drinking in the sight of his beloved face one more time. I'm sorry, my love. I know this isn't what you wanted for us, but sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to play the game by their rules. Maria, wait, Tyler said urgently. Let's discuss this rationally. There has to be a solution that doesn't involve bloodshed. You're right, Maria agreed. There is a solution. You leave. You go back to your king and your merchant and tell them that the woman they wanted is no longer available. You find some other way to satisfy the tribute demand that doesn't involve human trafficking. That's impossible, Frank White protested. The king has already made his decision. He won't accept refusal. Then he'll have to accept disappointment instead, Maria replied calmly. Because I am not leaving this tower alive unless it's by my own choice, as a free woman. Roy stepped closer, moving slowly and carefully so as not to startle her. My love, I need you to listen to me. I know you think this is the only way to protect our life together, but you're wrong. A life without you isn't worth protecting. If you die, then everything we've built here dies with you. Maria felt her resolve waver as she saw the pain in his eyes. She had been so focused on preventing her own enslavement that she hadn't fully considered what her death would do to the man she loved. But if I go with them, she said softly, then I'm lost to you anyway. At least this way, you'll remember me as I am, not as whatever they turned me into. And I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I failed to protect you, Roy replied. That when you needed me most, I stood by and watched you die because I was too weak or too cowardly to find another solution. Tyler seized on this opening. Roy's right, Lady Maria. Your death solves nothing. It only creates more problems. But if you come with us willingly, there's still hope. The merchant is not a cruel man, merely an eccentric one. You might find that your new life is not as terrible as you imagine. Maria laughed bitterly. Spoken like a man who has never been sold. Tell me, Sir Tyler, would you be so sanguine about the arrangement if it were your wife being offered to the highest bidder? Tyler's silence was answer enough. The standoff stretched on, each side waiting for the other to blink first. Maria could feel her arm beginning to tremble from holding the knife in position, but she forced herself to maintain the pose. She had committed to this course of action, and she would see it through to whatever end awaited. It was Roy who finally broke the stalemate. There is another way, he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of grim determination that made everyone in the room turn to look at him. Challenge me. Tyler frowned in confusion. What? Challenge me to single combat, Roy repeated, his hand moving to rest on his sword hilt. You want my lands, my title, my wife. Take them by force if you can. But do it honorably according to the old laws. Single combat, to the death, winner takes all. Roy, no, Maria breathed, but he ignored her protest. It's perfect, Roy continued, warming to his theme. If you win, you get everything you came for and more. The lands, the title, and a widow who might be more amenable to negotiation than a wife defending her marriage. If I win, you leave empty-handed and never return. Tyler shook his head slowly. Brother, you know I can't accept such a challenge. We're family. I won't raise my sword against you, no matter what's at stake. Then send one of your champions, Roy said, gesturing toward Frank and Ethan. Either of them would do nicely. Or better yet, go back to the capital and bring the merchant himself. Let him fight for what he wants to buy. This is madness, Frank White protested. The age of trial by combat is over. We settle disputes with law and negotiation now, not with swords and bloodshed. The law says I owe the king tribute, Roy replied. It also says that a knight may defend his honor and his property through combat when other remedies have failed. I'm invoking that right. Maria slowly lowered the knife from her throat, understanding what Roy was trying to do. He was forcing their enemies to choose between taking what they wanted through violence or walking away empty-handed. It was a brilliant strategy, but also a desperately dangerous one. You can't win against all of them, she said quietly. I don't have to win against all of them, Roy replied. I only have to win against one, and I've been preparing for this fight my entire life. Tyler looked genuinely distressed by the turn of events. Roy, please reconsider. There has to be another way. I don't want to see you die over this. Then don't force the issue, Roy said simply. Leave now and we can pretend this conversation never happened. Continue to press your demands, and I'll have no choice but to defend what's mine. Ethan Ramirez stepped forward, his hand on his sword. I'll accept the challenge, he said grimly. Someone has to end this foolishness before it gets completely out of hand. Ethan, no, Tyler said sharply, but the other knight shook his head. It's the only way, Tyler. We can't go back to the king empty-handed, and we can't let them threaten suicide every time we try to collect what's owed. This ends here, one way or another. Roy nodded approvingly. Sir Ethan Ramirez, I accept your challenge. Single combat to the death in the courtyard. The victor claims all that the loser possessed, including his debts and obligations. Agreed, Ethan replied formally. And so it was that Maria found herself pressed against the stone wall of the tower, watching the two men circle each other in the snow-covered courtyard below. Roy moved with the fluid grace of a born warrior, his sword seeming to float in his hand like an extension of his will. Ethan was larger and stronger, but there was something in Roy's eyes that spoke of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The battle was brief but vicious. Steel rang against steel as the two knights tested each other's defenses, looking for weaknesses and openings. Roy's superior skill became apparent quickly, his blade finding gaps in Ethan's guard that the larger man couldn't quite close in time. But Ethan was no novice, and he fought with the desperate fury of a man who knew his life depended on victory. He pressed forward relentlessly, using his size and strength to try to overwhelm Roy's technical advantages. In the end, it was Roy's intimate knowledge of the courtyard that proved decisive. He drew Ethan toward a patch of ice-covered stones, then sidestepped at the crucial moment, sending his opponent sliding helplessly forward. Roy's sword found its mark with surgical precision, piercing Ethan's heart before he could recover his balance. Ethan Ramirez fell face first into the snow, his blood spreading in a dark stain around his body. Roy stood over him for a moment, breathing heavily, then turned to face Tyler and Frank White. It's finished, he said simply. By right of combat, my debts are cleared and my property is secure. Take your men and go. Tyler stared at his brother for a long moment, his expression unreadable. This isn't over, Roy. The king will send others, and eventually someone will come who can't be defeated by sword and courage alone. Perhaps, Roy replied, but today is not that day, and tomorrow, well, tomorrow we'll face whatever comes. Together. Tyler nodded slowly, then turned and walked away, Frank White following reluctantly behind. Their men mounted up and rode away across the causeway, leaving Roy and Maria alone with the body of their defeated enemy and the uncertain promise of their hard-won freedom. Maria descended from the tower and walked out into the courtyard, her feet crunching on the blood-stained snow. Roy met her halfway, and she threw her arms around him, holding him tight against her, as if she could anchor him to life through sheer force of will. It's over, he whispered into her hair. We're safe. For now, Maria replied. But Tyler was right. Others will come, and we can't fight them all. Roy pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with a fierce joy that transformed his entire face. Then we'll face them as we face this one, together, as husband and wife, as partners, as two people who refuse to let the world define their worth. Maria smiled through her tears, understanding at last what it meant to be truly free. Not free from danger or hardship or the cruelty of others, but free to choose her own response to those challenges. Free to stand beside the man she loved and fight for the life they had built together. Together, she agreed and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of blood and snow and the sweet possibility of tomorrow. The winter wind howled around them, but inside the circle of each other's arms, all was warm and still and perfectly, impossibly right.